Our final topic is the idea of externalities. And initially, just launching straight into it. What is an externality? So just to give you a very, very simple definition. An externality is a direct effect of the actions of one person or firm on the welfare of another person or firm. So that's straightforward. But this part here, this is the important thing about externalities. In a way that is not transmitted by market prices. So you've studied externalities before. You've probably got an idea about what an externality is. But again, if I put that definition up there, it's not immediately obvious what an externality is. So that's just our definition, just to get us going. And the important part is this last part here. A person or firm affects another person or firm, but in a way that is not transmitted by market prices. So that's definition. Probably a much easier way to appreciate what an externality is by way of example. So, my neighbours, if they were playing loud music, or if they play loud music all night long, that is an example of an externality. The very fact that they listen to loud music all night long affects me. It has a detrimental impact upon my welfare. So this is an example of an externality. And more precisely, this is actually an example of a consumption externality. Now, a consumption externality occurs when the consumption activities of a consumer affects someone else or affects a firm. Well, in that example that I gave you, my neighbours will be the consumers of loud music. And the very fact that they are consuming this loud music has a detrimental impact upon my welfare. Therefore, this is an example of a consumption externality, where their consumption of loud music has an impact upon me. Now, in the same way, we could also define a production externality. And a production externality will occur when the production activities of a firm affect the welfare or the opportunities available to consumers or indeed other firms. So that's a production externality. Comes as a byproduct of the production process. And a good idea of what production externalities are and how they arise relates to, or would relate to, the idea that you will often see beekeepers and orchards co-located, located next to each other. So the idea here is that bees, in order to produce honey, need to collect pollen. And where do they get that from? They get it from trees. And what do the owners of tree orchards require for their fruit to grow? They require the trees to be pollinated by bees. So typically, very, very often, you will see orchards, fruit orchards, and beekeepers located next to each other. In this particular example, there are positive production externalities. The production possibilities of one firm is positively affected by another firm. So this is an example of a production externality. Now, it doesn't matter what type of externality we're talking about. It could be consumption, it could be production. They can be either positive or negative. They can have a positive impact upon the activities or the welfare of others, or they could have a detrimental impact. And if they have a detrimental impact, they're described as a negative externality. If they have a beneficial impact, they're described as a positive externality. But it doesn't matter what type of externality we're talking about. be it consumption or production, be it positive or negative. The important thing about externalities is that there is no market for them. There are things that we're all concerned about. There are things that firms are concerned about. But when a market doesn't exist for these, and there is an impact upon others as a result of these, that is what's needed for an externality. And that is the key problem. Externalities arise because there are things that we are concerned about, but they are not traded on open markets. There is no market for them. And it's this exact lack of a market that causes a problem. Because if we have a market, we can price something, we can trade something. But invariably with externalities, and the reason problems arise with externalities is precisely because of that last point there. There is no market for it. And as such, we can get inefficient outcomes. Now, exactly what these inefficient outcomes are, I'll explain as this lecture unfolds. But just to give you a roadmap, I've told you what externalities are, just to give you a very quick roadmap of where we're going to be heading in this lecture. The first thing we'll do is I'm going to give you a very, very specific example. I'm going to take a consumption, a very particular consumption externality example, and I'll show you how, in the presence of this externality, the outcome that we get is inefficient. And not just inefficient, that's not just what the problem is, but we'll show it actually, that inefficiency, precisely what we mean. It's going back again to this concept of Pareto inefficiency. That idea, if you can't make someone better off without making someone else worse off, that's a Pareto efficient outcome. Well, that's how we're going to measure our problems, our inefficiency with externalities, in terms of Pareto efficiency. But as well as looking at the inherent problems associated with externalities, we'll also see how bargaining can actually help resolve this issue, this problem. So I said that the underlying feature of externalities was no market existed. And if there's no market exist, the outcome that we'll get will be inefficient, Pareto inefficient. However, it's possible to mimic markets. And in doing so, if we mimic a market, if we allow bargaining to take place between individuals, we can overcome the inherent problems that arise with externalities. Then, what we'll conclude with is we're going to look at a very specific type of good. And this will be the idea of common property. And common property and the drivers with this type of good and the problems that arise with common property are all down again to externalities. So that will be what we're going to conclude on. So we'll start with that example of consumption externality. We'll see the problem that causes in terms of efficiency. We'll use bargaining to maybe resolve that issue. And then we'll conclude, our very, very last thing, is we'll look at the idea of common property, which in itself is inherently related to externalities. So, that's our overview of what we're going to do. What we're going to start with then is a very particular consumption externality. And we're going to look at this consumption externality in a framework that you are by now all familiar with. We're going to look at this consumption externality within a general equilibrium setting. And the example we're going to look at is going to be the case of two roommates. So two students, they shared a room together. And these roommates are going to be called Person A and Person B. Now, Person A and Person B are inherently different. Person A is a smoker. Person B, roommate B, is a non-smoker. So straight away, you can see some sort of conflict is going to occur. And the externality, as you can imagine, arises because of person A, and he's smoking. And all the fumes and smoke that he generates. That is going to be our externality. So, two roommates, and it's person A who is the smoker. Now, for our two roommates, they have tastes and preferences over goods. And we're going to look at two goods that are available to our two roommates. And these two goods are smoke and money. Now, in terms of these two goods, money is always straightforward. It's pretty obvious we all like more money. And so for both person A and person B, they both prefer more money to less money. So in that regard, money for both of our roommates is an economic good. More is preferred to less. So money is absolutely no problem, absolutely no ambiguity. Where there is a difference, though, is it turns to the smoke generated by person A smoking. For person A, smoke is an economic good. The more smoke that there is, it means that person A is smoking. Now let's ignore all the health considerations. If person A smokes, he gets satisfaction. That's what he enjoys doing. So the more he smokes, the more pleasure he gets, the more satisfaction he gets. And so, for roommate A, smoke is an economic good. He would rather more smoke than less smoke. If there's more smoke, it means he's smoking more. If he smokes more, he's happy. So for person A, smoke is an economic good. However, for his roommate, person B, the non-smoker, smoke is an economic bad. He doesn't like smoking. He doesn't want to breathe in the smoke produced by his roommate. And if he does, it makes him unwell. It has a detrimental effect upon his well-being. So, what does that mean? It means for person B, smoke is an economic bad. The more smoke he's forced to breathe in, the worse off it makes him feel. Smoke for person B is an economic bad. And this is the only difference between these two consumers. It's smoke and how they value smoke and their perception of smoke. For person A, it's an economic good, so he wants more of it. For person B, it's an economic bad, so he wants less. So, that's our example. That's our basic setup. What we're now going to do is return to that diagram that you have in front of you in the handout. Okay. We're going to return to this diagram here an awful, awful lot today. So this is our, everyone in the rivals, you've got the handouts? You've not put your hands up? No one? Okay, everyone's got it then. So, this, we said, was our general equilibrium framework that we're going to analyse this question. So, this diagram is an example of a Edgeworth box diagram. This here is our Edgeworth box. And to start the ball rolling, forget about what's in the middle. Just think about the outside of that box and what it is. So, we have our Edgeworth box diagram, and given the standard considerations that we've been through in the past, what we have are our two consumers. And we will have the origins of our two consumers. So here, in the bottom left-hand corner, is the origin for person A. Now, person A was the smoker. In the top right-hand corner, we have the origin for our other roommate, person B. And remember, person B is the non-smoker. Then, measured horizontally and vertically, we have our two goods. And our two goods are money and smoke. And remember the dimensions of the Edgeworth box, when we construct an Edgeworth box, its dimensions are determined by the total availability of the two goods. So the width of the Edgeworth box is determined by the total amount of money. The total amount of money that person A has and person B has. So that determines the width of the Edgeworth box. And that's not going to pose too much of a problem. Person A and person B will have quantifiable amounts of money. And when we add them together, that will determine the width of that Edgeworth box. The height of the Edgeworth box, again, it's determined by the total availability of smoke. But remember, where does smoke come from? Smoke comes as a byproduct of person A's habits. And so, the more he smokes, the more smoke there will be within the room. So, for example, if person A smoked absolutely nothing, there wouldn't be any smoke in the room. And so, the Edgeworth box would not have any height at all. It would be somewhere along that bottom line there. At the other extreme, we've got the maximum amount. At the top of the Edgeworth box, we've got the absolute maximum amount of smoke that person A could possibly generate. That is the proverbial smoke-filled room. But where we are, zero smoke or smoke-filled room will depend upon how much person A smokes. But the maximum amount is determined by the maximum amount determines the height of the Edgeworth box. So that sets out our general framework. So now that we've set up the dimensions, the basic setup of the Edgeworth box, let's say something about these persons' tastes and preferences over the two goods. And let's start with person A. And remember, person A, the smoker, wants more money and he wants more smoke. For him, these are both economic goods. Well, if we can represent person A's tastes over these two economic goods, we can represent his preferences with a conventional set of indifference curves. So, for example, that indifference curve there, UA, that smaller indifference curve there, that indifference curve UA prime, and again, that smaller indifference curve there. Those are just examples of indifference curves for person A. And as we move away from person A's origin, we're increasing his consumption of money and smoke. And both of these make person A better off, make him feel better. And so as we move from this bottom left-hand corner away to this top right-hand corner, for person A, he moves on to higher indifference curves and he's better off. Higher indifference curves are more preferred for person A. And that makes perfect sense. That's the sort of thing that we did previously in our lecture on exchange. However, person B is slightly different. Person B's origin in the top right-hand corner, and we've got, for example, that indifference curve there, UB prime for person B, that higher indifference curve there, that higher indifference curve there, and indeed that higher indifference curve there, UB. So, again, we've got a set of indifference curves for person B that move away from his origin. Remember, for roommate B, money is an economic good, so he wants more money. If we give him more money, he's better off. But smoking is an economic bad. As we force person B to inhale, to consume more smoke, it makes him worse off. For him, it was an economic bad. So, as we move away from person B's origin onto these higher and higher difference curves, what happens to his welfare? Do you think it would increase or decrease? Now, if you have a stab in the dark, look at one of these goods is an economic bad. If we force him to consume more of the economic bad, you would expect to see a reduction in his welfare. That makes perfect sense. However, this diagram that we've got here, as we move further and further away from person B's origin, his welfare increases. Well, that might sound a little bit strange. How does his welfare increase? Surely he's consuming more money, okay, so that makes him better off. But he's also consuming more smoke. And if you consume more of an economic bad, you're worse off. So why have I said a movement away from person B's origin into this direction makes him better off? Well, it's all got to do with how we measure these two goods and where we measure them from. Now, when we're talking about money, we measure the amount of money each person has relative to his origin. So for person A, measured horizontally, how far we are from person A's origin reflects the amount of money he has. And for person B, how far he is away from his origin reflects the amount of money he has also. And it makes perfect sense with money because there can be two tangible, different amounts of money. Person A can have some money, person B has some money. So it makes sense to measure each of these relative to their own origin. Smoke, though, is different. These are two roommates sharing a room. There is only one amount of smoke that's available. Two roommates, they're in the room together, they cannot have different amounts of smoke. There is only one amount available. So in that sense, it wouldn't make it appropriate to measure smoke from each person's origin, from two different points. There's only one amount of smoke that's available. And so, in this diagram, what we do is we're measuring smoke from person A's origin. And as we move away from person A's origin, the amount of smoke increases. And if you think about it, what does that mean as person B moves away from his origin? That the amount of money he has increases, but the amount of smoke is doing what? It's decreasing. He's getting closer to A's origin. So, smoke is only measured from one point, from person A's origin. And therefore, as we're moving away from B's origin, he has more money and less smoke. And both of those do what? Make him happy. Increase his wealth. And so, what happens is person B's indifference curves, as we move from the top right to the bottom left, are again associated with an increase in wealth, even though smoke is an economic bad. So, that's our basic setup. That's our Edgeworth box. That's how you interpret what's going on in there. Now, when we've looked at general equilibrium in the past, we've started off with an endowment point. We need to show how much of these goods are available to both consumers. So, how much money is available? How much smoke is available? Well, money doesn't provide a problem. Person A, person B have a given amount of money. So let's say purely for convenience, that person A and person B have exactly the same amount of money. So, if they have an endowment of money, each, that is exactly the same, we're going to be somewhere in the middle of the Edgeworth box. However far we're away from person A's origin is exactly the same distance as we are away from person B's origin. So, that would mean if they've got the same amount of money, and this is purely just to get us started, it makes no difference whatsoever. But if person A and person B have the exact same amount of money, we know that the endowment point will lie somewhere along that dotted line. exactly where along that dotted line, though, will be determined by the initial endowment of smoke. And that, in itself, will depend upon property rights, or the legal entitlements of our two roommates. Is it, for example, the case that person A, the smoker, is allowed to smoke as much as he wants? He can smoke when he wants, where he wants, and as much as he wants. If the legal framework is such that that is the case, he can do whatever he wants, well, the initial endowment of smoke would be all the way up there. Alternatively, it could be that person B has the right to clean air. His roommate is in no way allowed to pollute the clean air in this room. So the initial endowment of smoke is 0. Well, if that were the case, our initial endowment would be down there. So each individual has exactly the same amount of money, but the initial endowment of smoke is 0. So that smoke, the initial endowment, is 0. And that is just determined by the legal framework, what person A and what person B are allowed to do. But this fact that there's a legal entitlement, an endowment of clean air, that there is no smoke, is just like the endowment of any other good. Individuals have this, and if they want to, they can trade this endowment away. And so, what question I want you to think about, to consider, is let's say that the legal endowment is for clean air, that person A is not allowed to smoke. So let's say that the roommates did start at that endowment point E. Question is, would they be happy to stay there? Or, relatedly, is that an efficient point? Is it a Pareto efficient point? Well, to answer that question of Pareto efficiency, what would we do? We'd put the initial indifference curves that pass through our endowment point. So for person A, given his tastes and preferences, indifference curve UA passes through the initial endowment point. And for person B, given his tastes and preferences for these two goods, his initial indifference curve is that one there, UB. Now what is that one here? These indifference curves are crossing. And we've seen before, when indifference curves cross, it creates scope for a Pareto improvement. But these parties, these concerned parties, the roommates, can bargain, can trade with one another to make themselves better off. So if they move from the initial endowment point, i.e., anywhere into that area bounded between the two sets of indifference curves, they would make a Pareto improvement. When we can make someone better off without making someone else worse off, that's a Pareto improvement. And that's the way that we saw previously of exchange taking place, of these individuals bargaining with one another, identifying mutually advantageous trade. And one such an example could be the individuals traded from the endowment at E to an equilibrium there at point X. Now the way that I've described point X is where the two sets of indifference curves just touch one another, where they're tangential to each other. But what does it mean for person A? Person A is now on a higher indifference curve relative to UA. And person B is on a higher indifference curve relative to UV. So both individuals have made themselves better off. We've had the initial endowment, but the individuals have traded. They bargain with one another. And rather than staying at the initial endowment at E, they arrive at the equilibrium at point X. And what do we know about point X? Well, because the indifference curves are tangential, it means we have a Pareto efficient outcome. So our individuals start at point E and they trade this way to a Pareto efficient outcome such as X. Now if we identified an outcome where the indifference curves weren't tangential, we know that our roommates wouldn't be happy to stay there. There would still be potential to trade. And they'd continue to do this until we arrived at a Pareto efficient point such as X. Now, think about logically, intuitively, what would have happened to go from the endowment point to point X. We started off at the situation where both individuals had exactly the same amount of money. And person A, though, was not allowed to smoke. There was zero smoke available. And yet, our new equilibrium at point X, what do we notice about smoke? It's no longer zero, there's a positive amount of smoke. So person A has been allowed to smoke. His roommate has allowed him to smoke. And why has he done this? Well, now look at the monies available. They've no longer got an even allocation of money, but person B has got slightly more. Person A has got slightly less. So what's happened? Person A has paid his roommate to allow him to smoke. That is the bargain that's taken place. And in bargaining with themselves, we've arrived at a Pareto efficient outcome. Now, what I want you to do is take a step back from this and think about what I said right at the beginning. When externalities arise, it causes a problem. We get inefficient outcomes. And it causes a problem. But what I've shown here, if these individuals are free to bargain amongst themselves, actually, it isn't a problem. Because these individuals can arrive at an outcome that is Pareto efficient. And that finding, in the presence of externalities, individuals can trade. That finding that we get here is known as the Coase theorem. And that would say, just to give you a formal definition, the Coase theorem would say that once ownership rights to a resource are established, individuals will bargain their way to an efficient use of the resource. That is the Coase theorem. And that is what we've done here. The first part, once ownership rights to a resource are established. Well, how did I start this off? I said, let's assume that person B has the right to clean air. Person A is not allowed to smoke. That's clearly defined the ownership rights. And once we've done that, that pins down our initial endowment to that point there. So now we've established property rights. Individuals can trade these goods amongst themselves. And once they do that, what they will do is bargain their way to an efficient use of the resource. The outcome that we get is Pareto efficient. However, I've only given you one example here. This initial endowment point was on the assumption that property rights are assigned to the non-smoker, but it's totally perfectly entitled to clean air. However, this efficient outcome that we've identified, though, it does not mean that the amount of the externality available stays at zero. That is not what an efficient outcome means. Outcome, the equilibrium outcome that we get at point X, there is smoke present. An efficient outcome does not mean zero level of the externality. If that were the case, well, that's where we would have started from. Given these individuals tastes, preferences, incentives, etc., they bargained amongst themselves such that the outcome, even in the presence of an externality, is Pareto efficient. And at point X, it's not possible to make one person better off without making the other worse off. But that initial endowment at point E, where the property rights were assigned to the non-smoker, is just one example. Let's say that the scenario was completely reversed. That now, person A, the smoker, is allowed to smoke as much as he wants, and his roommate just has to live with it. Well, if that were the case then, the initial endowment of smoke would be here along the top of the Edgeworth box. And again, assuming that our two roommates have exactly the same amount of money, that means our initial endowment would be, at this time, at point E prime. We've just changed the way the property rights are assigned, and we've got a new endowment point. Well, what would happen at point E prime? Well, again, we'd ask ourselves, are our roommates happy to stay there? Well, they wouldn't be, because if we draw the indifference curves for person B and for person A that pass through this initial endowment point, they cross. Therefore, it's a Pareto inefficient outcome. And if they move into this Pareto improvement set, that area bounded between the two difference curves, we make both parties better off. And you can easily imagine, trade taking place to move the individuals from point E to a point X prime. And going from E prime to X prime, both are better off. Person A is on a higher indifference curve. Person B is on a higher indifference curve. They'd both be made better off. This time though, look what's happened. We started off where they had exactly the same amount of money. They were on that dotted line somewhere. So exactly the same amount of money. But there was the proverbial smoke-filled room. Now though, at our equilibrium at X prime, person B has less money than person A. And there's also less smoke available. So what's happened? Well, now that the property rights were assigned to person A, he's got the right to smoke. His roommate, person B, has paid him a little bit of money not to smoke. And they've traded amongst themselves, they've bargained amongst themselves until, again, we arrive at a Pareto efficient outcome. And again, what does that mean? It means that the level of the externality is not zero. In all cases, it doesn't really matter where we are, an efficient outcome does not mean zero level of the externality. But compare those two possible points, x and x prime. You can see though that the amount of the externality differs. X, we've got a lower level of smoke. In x prime, we've got a higher level of smoke. Even though these are Pareto inefficient outcomes, they have different endowment, different amounts of the externality dependent upon where we start from. And that leads us to thinking, well, what is that line there that I've drawn through the middle? Well, that will then be that locus of Pareto efficient points. Those points, when we connect them up, make the contract curve, the efficiency locus. And what we know within this box here, that even in the presence of externalities, it does not matter how we assign property rights. If individuals are free to bargain with themselves, the outcome that we get is guaranteed to be Pareto efficient. It will lie along the contract curve. It will lie upon the contract curve somewhere. So in that sense, I set this whole lecture up and said externalities are a problem. Well, the Coase theorem would seem to suggest that it isn't. Even though there are things that we are concerned with, there is no market for them. But if these individuals can trade amongst themselves, they can mimic the market. They can create the market for themselves. And the outcome that we get will guarantee to be Pareto efficient. So doesn't that seem a little bit strange then? That I started this lecture off saying externalities are a problem. But the Coase theorem has just said it isn't a problem. That it doesn't matter where we start from, the outcome that we will get, nevertheless, will be Pareto inefficient. Well, that's fine in theory. What happens in practice, though? Is the Coase theorem always going to work? And that's what I want to do for this last part of the lecture now, before you have a break, is go through scenarios that would arise, practical problems that prevent the Coase theorem leading to these Pareto inefficient outcomes that we've just described. So I'm only going to go through 4 different aspects. And the first practical problem that arises with the Coase theorem is when property rights are not well defined. And the vast majority of practical problems that do arise and prevent the Coase theorem from working arise precisely because of this, because of poorly defined property rights. Now, in our definition of the Coase theorem, the very, very first thing that we started off with, that very first part of that definition, says once property rights have been established. And in the diagram that I gave you, we had 2 scenarios. In one I said, well, let's assume that person B had the right to clean air. It defines a point where bargaining can start from. The alternative scenario, I said, let's assume that person A has the right to smoke as much as he wants. Again, it defines a very, very clear starting point that bargaining takes place from. But what would happen when property rights are poorly defined? Well, let's take an example. Let's take another example. Let's say my neighbour he believes that he's got an absolute God-given right to grow great big fir trees in his garden. And these fir trees will cast shadow on my garden. Now, I believe that I've absolutely got a right to have as much sunlight in my garden as I want. That's what I believe. My neighbour would believe he can grow a fir tree 100 feet high, and it's his absolute right to do that. Now, there's a problem. Given that there obviously could be scope for bargaining, I could say to him, look, do you mind chopping your trees down a bit so I can let some light into my garden? And he might be amenable to that. He said, okay, look, I'll do that, but you've got to pay me. Alternatively, I might say to him, well, look, I don't mind you growing your fir trees. They're going to cast some shadow on my garden, but I'll let you grow them a little bit higher if you pay me. But the problem is, you can see there's clearly scope for bargaining to take place here. There's clearly scope for us to come to some arrangement. But whatever that arrangement is, it involves someone paying the other person. So if I believe that I've got the right to as much sunlight on my garden as I could possibly have, well, I'm not going to pay my neighbour to chop his trees down. And in the same way, if my neighbour believes he can grow his trees as high as he wants, he's not going to pay me to cast shadow on my garden. So even though there's clearly scope for bargaining to take place that would benefit us both, where do property rights lie? If it's not clearly defined, if it isn't well established in law, can you grow your trees as high as you want? Can you cast shadow on someone's garden? If that's not clearly defined, even though there's scope for bargaining to take place, it's who compensates who. And if we don't know that, the Coase theorem can't get started. And hence, all those scenarios that we ran through, so look, we can get an efficient outcome, even in the presence of externalities. That process does not even start if property rights are not clearly defined. So that's the first practical problem of arriving at an efficient outcome with a Coase theorem. Secondly, we've also got the issue of bargaining. Now, when any bargain takes place, there need to be costs and benefits. Now, obviously, the benefits are tangible, we can identify them. But the costs themselves must be less than the potential benefits. And if the costs are not less than the potential benefits, well, bargaining isn't going to take place. And let's take an example of air pollution. Now, air pollution is an externality that affects literally millions upon millions of people. Not just those people who are affected by air pollution, but also those firms producing air pollution. Now, we all know, using that example of air pollution, there are obvious benefits to reducing air pollution, to reducing this externality. But when there are a large number of parties involved, how do we get these literally millions and millions of concerned parties together at a sufficiently low cost to make bargaining worthwhile? So whilst there are obvious benefits to bargaining, the costs of getting all the parties together are prohibitively high. And in that sense then, if the costs are too high, bargaining isn't going to take place, because the costs will outweigh any potential benefits. And hence, if that's the case, the Coase theorem doesn't work. We still get an inefficient outcome. Now, related to this is also the idea, the phenomenon called the free rider problem. Again, think of that scenario of air pollution. Now, we can see, even if property rights were clearly defined, even if the costs of bargaining were sufficiently low, let's think about you as an individual. Would you want to get involved in the bargaining process? Because if someone else does the bargaining and air pollution is reduced, you would benefit regardless. So why do you want to incur the costs? Why should you put yourself out, incur the costs to reduce air pollution, when you'd benefit anyway if someone else does the bargaining and if they incur all the costs? The classic free rider problem. But it's not just you who has that incentive. Every single person has the exact same incentive. And even though there are obvious benefits to reducing air pollution, nobody gets involved. Bargaining doesn't take place, and we don't get that efficient outcome as predicted by the Coase theorem. Okay, last 2 points then. And again, let's think about that scenario of air pollution. Even if all the other factors were fulfilled, that nobody was going to free ride, that the costs were sufficiently low, that property rights were clearly defined. In the case of air pollution, there are many, many thousands, millions of people affected by air pollution. And there are many thousands and thousands of firms who would be causing the air pollution. Now, even if property rights were such that everybody was entitled to clean air, and their air was being polluted, they would have a case for seeking compensation. But in that case of air pollution, how do those people who are affected by air pollution firstly precisely identify those firms that are polluting their air? Not only do they need to precisely identify them, they also need to quantify the amount of damage inflicted by those firms upon them. And it's a very, very difficult scenario to get a grip on. So, what does that mean? Even though there are obvious benefits to bargaining, it requires compensation. But if you're going to require compensation, you've got to identify precisely those people having a detrimental effect upon your welfare. And you've got to quantify the effect that they have on your welfare. And if you're not able to both identify and quantify the source of damage, how can you have a compensation system? And hence, another reason for supposing that in practice, the Coase theorem won't work. And hence, we won't get an efficient outcome in the presence of externalities. And then lastly, asymmetric information. Now, asymmetric information is a common problem in economics. Asymmetric information occurs when people know different things. When there's an asymmetric information set. So you know different things. So I want to go back to that example we used right at the beginning of our two roommates. Person A, the smoker, person B, the non-smoker. So let's just say that person A is allowed to smoke as much as he wants. So we've identified the property he wants. Person A can do what he wants. He's allowed to smoke. And the monetary value that he places upon his habit is £20. So the benefit that I derive from smoking is worth £20 to me. However, his roommate, the non-smoker, would value clean air, I should say, at £30. So that represents the amount of money that he would be willing to pay for his roommate not to smoke. So you can see here, there's clearly scope for mutually advantageous bargain to take place. So, for example, if person B offered his roommate £25 not to smoke, would that benefit the non-smoker? Yeah. He would pay £25 for something he values at £30. He wants clean air, he pays £25 to his roommate not to smoke, and he gets clean air. He pays £25, but he would have been prepared to pay £30. Does this work for the smoker? Well, he receives £25 for something he only values at £20. So both parties are better off. That's a perfect way that the Coase theorem works. However, now comes the part for information asymmetry. The fact that person A values smoking at £20 is a piece of information that's probably only known to person A himself. He knows how much he values smoking at, but his roommate doesn't. His roommate can only guess. See, this is the information asymmetry. Person A knows it exactly, but person B doesn't. So there's information asymmetry. So, person B needs to have an estimate, a valuation of what he thinks his roommate places on smoking. And his estimate is £15. So he says the monetary value that my roommate gets from smoking is £15. So, what does he do? Well, this negotiation process then starts. So, okay, you value smoking at £15. I'm going to give you a fair offer. I will pay you £16 not to smoke. And in the view of person B, the non-smoker, that is a fair offer. He's given him £16 for something he only values at 15. What's going to happen? Person A is going to reject this offer out of hand. He's been given £16, but he values smoking at 20. Of course he's going to reject it. But the fact that he rejects it would then make, or is likely to make person B, the non-smoker, think, actually, you're just playing games. You're bluffing him. And as such then, negotiations break down. They pull out. And this is the problem with information asymmetry. Even though there clearly are benefits to parties bargaining, in the presence of information asymmetry, the whole bargaining process can break down. And if the bargaining process breaks down, you don't get the outcome predicted by the Coase theorem. At the beginning of the lecture, I said that we're going to look at common property and relate this to this topic that we're doing of externalities. Now, common property is a resource to which everyone has free, unrestricted access. And you'll be very, very familiar with examples of common property. But what I want you to do for the moment is just reflect upon what common property is. What I want to know is which of the following is not an example of common property. Right? A toll-free motorway, fishing grounds in international waters, a swimming pool, or a public park. Of course, a swimming pool. Now, if you think of the other ones, a toll-free motorway. Is it free to go on? Yes. Can you restrict access to it? No. Fishing grounds in international waters. Can anyone stop fishing boats going there and fishing? No. A public park. Again, you can't be prevented from entering it. And it's free. A swimming pool, though. Can someone own that? Can someone restrict access? Yeah. That could be a privately owned good. You could, and if it is owned by somebody, if you don't get unrestricted access to it, it is not a common property. It is not common property. So, most of you, well done. Just think around that idea. Common property. Free, unrestricted access. So, what I'm going to do to explain this idea of common property and also show you the efficiency implications of common property and identify the source of the externality, we're going to look at the initial exposition of common property, the way in which it was initially developed. And that is the idea of common lands. And the example I'll give you is an agricultural village. And in this agricultural village, there is a common field. And all the residents of this village are allowed to use and access that common field. And they can do so costlessly. They do not need to pay for it. It's a common. It's a common good. They can all use that. Now, the only reason, though, that the villagers want to access this common field, it's not to walk around it, it's not to enjoy it, but it's to graze their goats. This village has common land. All the villagers have free, unrestricted access to that common land. And they want access to that to take their goats there, and their goats can eat the grass. That's the point of the common good, the common property. Now, as I work through this example, what I want to do is look at two different allocation mechanisms. One is where this common land is indeed common property, where no one owns it, where it's a resource for the entire village, the entire community, and anyone can graze their goats there. The alternative mechanism, is where someone owns that land and they can restrict access to it. So we're going to compare and contrast those two different outcomes. So, this very simple diagram, it's only got 3 lines. It's on the reverse side, even though it's simple, it's on the reverse side of the handout for you. So, very, very simple diagram. It's easy, though, to get it wrong. Now, we said that the villagers have unrestricted access to this common property. What we're going to describe is what's known here as the tragedy of the commons, where all of these villagers with unrestricted access to the common land will actually overuse that resource. And here's why. Now, the only reason that the villagers want to put their goats to graze on the common land is to produce milk. That's the only reason for it. They want their goats for the milk. And naturally, the more goats, the more grass that the goats consume, the healthier they are, and the more milk that it can produce. And the villagers want them to use more milk as opposed to less milk. But that's the only reason for the goats being on that common land, to graze and to produce milk. However, there's a real problem in that as the villagers take their goats to the common land to graze, as they eat more and more of the grass, as more and more goats go on the common land, there is increased competition for grass. Because with more goats, there's less grass that's available. So as the goats increase, as the number of goats grazing on this land increases, the average yield, the amount of milk on average that each goat can produce will fall. That reflects in the diagram that top line there. ARP stands for the average revenue product. So that's the price, that's the revenue that can be generated if the villagers sell the milk produced by the goats. It's the average revenue product. And what did we say? As the number of goats increases, and on the vertical axis we've got money, price or costs, and on the horizontal axis we've got the number of goats who graze. And as the number of goats grazing on the common land increases, there is increased competition. And so the goats can eat, individually, they can now eat less grass. If they eat less grass, the amount of milk that they can produce will fall. And hence, the average revenue product, the amount of milk produced by each goat, on average, will fall. So that's the average revenue product. And it will be declining. The other downward sloping line that we've got here is the marginal revenue product. That shows the value of the extra milk produced by the marginal goat. And if average revenue product slopes downwards, marginal revenue product must slope downwards even more steeply. It's that classic relationship between an average curve and a marginal curve. The only way the average will fall is if the next unit, the next goat, adds less than the preceding unit, the preceding goat. Classic batting average effect. If you've got an average, let's think about when you go to see your tutors in January, February to get your exam marks back, and I've probably used this example with you before. If you've got an average run of marks, and then you have your next exam mark that comes in, if your next exam mark, the marginal mark, is less than your average, what happens to the average? It falls. So if marginal is less than average, average is falling. What have we got here? Average is falling. Therefore, the marginal concept must be lowered. So the marginal revenue product is the value of the extra amount produced by the next goat. So that's the average revenue product, slopes downwards. The marginal revenue product will slope downwards even more steeply. So that's our basic setup. We've got average and marginal revenue product. That's the value of milk produced from the villagers grazing the goats on this common land. Now what I want to do is look at these two alternative allocation mechanisms. And the first is what happens when this is common land. When all the villagers have free, unregulated, unrestricted access to the field. Well, if you were a villager and you were thinking, do I want to put a goat on that land? What would you think? Do I want to put an extra goat on that land? You would think, okay, what's the cost to me of owning a goat? And what value of milk can that goat produce? So let's say for simplicity that the price of a goat, the cost of a goat is fixed. It's constant. That's reflected by that horizontal line there, which is the cost of owning a goat, or the cost of buying a goat. So if you had unrestricted access to this common land, you would say, okay, that's the cost of owning a goat. I would only wish to put an extra goat on that land if the value of milk it can produce is greater than the cost of owning that goat. And what's the value of milk goats can produce? That's given by the average revenue product. So that's the total value divided by the number of goats. And that is the consideration the villagers would take into account if there is unrestricted access, if it is common property. So you keep on, you would wish to add a goat until the point where the cost of owning a goat and the value of milk produced are the same. That, in the diagram, is at point A. Anywhere above, or to the right I should say, of point A, the value of output that goats can produce is less than the cost. And so you wouldn't want to graze goats anywhere to the right of that equilibrium grazing at point A. So you graze goats all the way until that point. That is the equilibrium grazing when we have common property. Now though, I want you to think about what would happen if an individual could control access to the field. And this individual was interested in maximising the welfare of the entire village. So they could restrict the number of goats that grazed on that land. Now what would that welfare maximising individual do? Well, they would think, if you put a goat on that land, what does it cost the village to graze that goat? What does it cost to own that goat? Well, that's our fixed cost per goat as given there. That doesn't change. But what about the other side? If you put that goat on the land, how much extra output does that goat produce? Now that isn't average revenue product, that's marginal revenue product. You look at the next goat, and if you want to maximise the well-being of the entire village, you look at the next goat, how much it costs the village, and how much it produces for the village. You look at the cost of the goat, and you look at the marginal revenue produced by that goat. So that would say the efficient level of grazing would be at point B, where the marginal cost of owning the goat is equal to the marginal revenue product, the marginal yield of the next goat. So what would that suggest? That would suggest that the socially efficient level of grazing is less than the actual equilibrium level of grazing when people have unrestricted access. And that is the exact problem with common property. If people have access to it, what they do is look at their own private costs and their own private benefits. So any individual would say, to me, what's the cost of owning a goat? To me, what are the benefits that I derive? And with common property, this leads to an overconsumption of the good. To maximise the welfare of society, you look at marginal cost and marginal benefit. And so, this will mean, it doesn't matter what type of example we're looking at. I've given you a very, very individualist example of common property and grazing. But it does not matter what type of common property we're looking at, this finding here will always be true. Common property is overused. We get an inefficiently high level of use of that resource. Now this is just an example of a common ground. Common property could extend to a whole host of other things, and the exact same principle will also apply. I mean, I'll just throw a few examples at you. If we start thinking again of common pools, and the reason I mention this, it at least puts historically things into perspective. When we had the first Gulf War in 1991, when Iraq invaded Kuwait, what was the pretext for this? Well, the pretext for this is that the Kuwaitis were extracting the oil as a common pool of oil that lies under the Arabian Peninsula. So the pretext from the Iraqis was that the Kuwaitis were extracting the oil too quickly. But all the countries in the area have access to that common pool. But if you extract the oil too quickly, it reduces the fluid pressure. If you reduce the fluid pressure, it makes it more difficult, and by extension, more costly to extract the oil in the future. And so, again, this is the issue, that any individual country will extract the oil, will use the resource too quickly. And that imposes an externality on others. Roads, again, a classic example. If you've got toll-free roads where people don't restrict access, what happens? You get congestion. Roads are overused. When you decide whether to drive on the road, what do you take into account? You take into account your own private costs and benefits, not the fact that you're imposing upon others. If you're using the road, others can't be using the road. Fisheries, exactly the same. That example I gave you with the Cahoon Pole about international fishing waters. What do we know about these as a common pool? The international fisheries, we get overfishing of resources. We take too many fish from the sea, and it impacts upon sustainability for the future. All the exact same scenario. Get a common pool resource, a common good, it is overconsumed. However, last question I want to ask you for today though, what's this topic on? Externalities. So, I've given you some examples of common pool, common goods, common property. Where though does the externality lie? So think about the tragedy of the commons. What underlies this, yep, we get that outcome where we get the good is overconsumed. People graze too many goats on the land, over and above what's socially efficient. Where, though, is the externality? Is it that individuals are only concerned with their private costs? Because the cost of owning a goat is not just its price? Is it because there's increased competition for grazing? Or is it because everyone has the exact same incentive to own a goat? Yeah, the source of the externality, when we started off this topic, this example, right, that's the slide I gave you right at the beginning. If people increase the number of goats, what does that mean? It means this increased competition for grass. And it's this increased competition that is the externality. The fact that these goats are eating more grass means that other people's goats can't eat as much. But individuals aren't concerned about this, they're only concerned about their own private costs. And if you look at all of those answers to that question there is not an incorrect statement there. All those statements are true. However, it's only that one, C, the increased competition for grazing, that is the source of the externality, and that is what causes the overconsumption.